All right, Daniel Cox, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you did a recent survey for the Survey Center on American Life, and it was about friendship. And you found that Americans overall have fewer friends than they did a few decades ago. But where things get really interesting is how things break down across gender lines. How does this decline compare in men versus women? Like, what are the numbers there?
Yeah, so we looked back over about 3 decades. And one of the things we did with this poll is we looked at what the Gallup survey had done in 1990. That was one of the most recent times they had done a survey on friendship. It's not a topic that gets polled a lot. And we looked at the numbers there. We replicated some of their questions, and we found really massive declines in the number of close friends that the Americans reported having. So in 1990, 55% of men had at least 6 close friends. So 6 or more. And in our latest poll, only 27%, about half as many had that many friends.
That's crazy. And was the decline in women as stark?
No, there was a decline. It was a double-digit decline from 41% down to 24%, but not nearly as stark as for the men. The other thing is, looking at the other side, we found that 15% of men today have no close friends, including about 1 in 5 young men. And so that's really stood out to us. So they have no one who they feel, no friends who they feel really close to.
What was that number like in 1990?
Only 3%. So, a 5-fold increase over that time period.
Okay, and we'll talk some more like what we think is going on with the decline in number of friends. But the other thing the survey hit, it was that not only do men have fewer friends than they did in 1990, but they report being less emotionally connected to the friends they do have. And so we've had guests on the podcast, researchers who studied friendship, male friendship in particular, and this idea of emotional connectivity, the argument they've made is that maybe it's not that useful because men and women, they socialize differently, right? Men tend to do things more shoulder to shoulder based around an activity. Women have more of that face-to-face emotional connection. And so comparing male and female friends isn't useful, isn't it? It isn't a fair comparison. So, I mean, does it matter if men aren't as emotionally connected to their friends as long as they have friends?
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on this, and particularly as a father, I'm raising 2 boys, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and thinking about their social development, their friendships, and what I want for them. And while I understand like that's a common idea that we shouldn't compare, and there's just some differences there, I think that it misses the mark a bit. And this idea that men and women somehow need different things from their friends is not quite right. I think both men and women benefit when they have close, intimate relationships with their friends. In our survey, in fact, both men and women were less likely to feel alone, to feel depressed or anxious when they had that kind of emotional support from their friends. So it matters. And men and women are equally likely to want these things. And we know this, that just men seek it out more from the women in their life than the men. So men with female friends are more likely to have emotional support and to get emotional support from their friends. And we know that married men are much more likely to lean on their spouse, whereas married women will lean on their spouse, but also look to their friendship network to support them. And so I think there's this really interesting argument that my former colleague Arthur Brooks makes, and I think he makes it quite persuasively when he argues that what makes all of us happy is having a stable affection, mutual understanding, and commitment. And this is what the best research tells us. And I think he was talking in terms of romantic relationships, but it's true for friendships as well. Good friendships can offer all these things. And so, I think to argue that men somehow don't need this and don't need to make these kind of emotional or intimate connections, I kind of categorically reject it. I think that men are perfectly capable of expressing and experiencing the entire array of human emotions. We're just socialized in ways, to make us think it's unnecessary or it feels uncomfortable.
And we'll get into more like where men get that emotional support. As you mentioned, usually it's women, some sort of woman, whether it's family member or their wife. But I mean, another argument I've heard is that one of the reasons men struggle more than women to make friends is because there's an idea of traditional masculinity that prevents them from doing so. Like the idea that men shouldn't be vulnerable. And that's what's keeping them from making friends. Did the survey reveal anything that either supports or calls into question that hypothesis?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting and perhaps a bit of a thorny question. when I look at my social media feed in response to this, I see liberals and conservatives kind of lining up in different camps. I think conservatives would argue that modern culture has feminized men in ways that makes it more difficult for men to engage in traditionally masculine activities or pastimes. There are fewer all male spaces, and societally we're sort of less accepting of men getting together and doing this kind of thing. I don't find that terribly convincing. And liberals conversely argue that it is this idea of toxic masculinity, and that's the root of the problem. Men are socialized to avoid showing affection, particularly to other men, and that stops them from forming more intimate connections with their male friends. And I think there's something there, although it's not the entire story. From an early age, it's well known that women are socialized to be more nurturing and relationship oriented than men. And men are taught to perceive intimacy with other men as effeminate or weak or unmanly and perhaps unnecessary. And I think homophobia probably plays a role in here somewhere. And I think, it's also true that notions of masculinity reduce the range of even accepted activities that men can engage with. When two men are going out to dinner together one-on-one, we think about it differently than if it's a man and a woman or two women getting together. And we've even developed some, kind of derogatory terminology to describe it. It's a man date.
But I don't know. So I look back, so I've studied, looked at male friendship for a long time. My grandfather, okay, so if you were born after 1980, you seemingly grew up in a period where there was sort of more of a progressive ideal of masculinity. You kind of got away from those traditional norms, right? You learned about, you were steeped in this stuff about being vulnerable, sharing your feelings, et cetera, et cetera. And you think that would help men have more friends today, but we have less friends than our grandfathers who, they were steeped in traditional ideas of masculinity, or even our great grandfathers. I mean, man, if you go back to the 19th century, you see these letters between man friends, and it was almost like a romance letter. So I don't know. I mean, so what do you think is going on there? I see that, and I'm like, well, we're seemingly more progressive about what it means to be a man, but we have worse problems making friends than our grandfathers or great grandfathers.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And it's one of the things where I would, not think that this is the entire story here. And when I preface that, my comments there, looking at our data, if you look at how younger men identify in terms of their masculinity, they're less likely to identify as traditionally masculine. But it's younger men who struggle most in forming and maintaining friendships. So this idea that, if we could just fix, culturally this idea of toxic masculinity, things would suddenly be better, I think is not the entire story. And I think we have to look to the institutions, the ways and the places men made friends, right? Whether it's church or, local civic engagement, all the different ways people can meet. One of the interesting things in our polls, we found that people are most likely to make close friends now at work, not through existing friends, not in their neighborhood. It's the workplace. And, there used to be, a really vibrant, locally focused sort of community that people could go into, engage with. People were friends with their neighbors. I think that all this kind of decline is playing a role in our ability to create and maintain friendships.
I want to talk about the work component in a bit here, because also I think the pandemic and the whole work from home thing has probably thrown a wrench in that. But another thing we've heard is, and researchers have found, is that women tend to be more willing to put in the effort in cultivation and maintenance of friendships more than men are. But do we know why that is? I mean, were you able to find anything out that with your survey?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't look at that specifically. I do think it's true that the poll found that men are engage in sort of activity-based friendships. Right? They have a lot of these you whether it's online. We asked about online playing video games. Younger men are much more likely to do this than just about anyone. But one of the issues there, I think, is particularly when you're thinking about getting together for sports or hobbies, hunting. All that stuff requires a lot of time and planning and logistics, much more so than just picking up the phone. So, the more intimate communication-based relationships that women are nurturing when they're friends are probably just easier to maintain. It's just different if you're sort of saying, hey, no, we've got to get together around doing a certain activity. I mean, first and foremost, the person has to live relatively close by. And, given how far flung we've all become, I think that creates an added hurdle.
Well, let's talk about that, the role of geographic mobility. So that's one dynamic we've heard might be playing in a role in the friendship recession amongst men. But I mean, the one thing I've heard, maybe you maybe your survey found something different, is that compared to previous generations, millennials are moving less. So you think, okay, if they're moving less, they're able to establish some sort of roots, they're able to make friends. So geographic mobility doesn't play a role. But did your survey find anything different?
Yeah. So I think that's right. So, geographic mobility, we know it's harmful to establishing and maintaining social connections. Right? If you move a lot, and any kid who moved around a lot growing up knows this, deep down, right? Like that, it's really hard to maintain friendships if you're moving around a lot. It's probably less so than it once was with the rise of social media, texting and messaging and all that. But one of the big things that happens when you move is you become disconnected, right? You detach from the local institutions, the clubs, places of worship, which are really important ways for us to maintain close connections with other people. And one of the things that I think is not really paid attention to a lot is, unlike marriage and our other familial relationships, there's not a lot of structure in friendships. I mean, it's sort of whatever you want to make of it. So I think when they're structured through membership in an institution or a club, that's really beneficial. And so I think when people move, you become kind of uprooted. And one of the things that we know that's true with men, particularly young men, is they're far less likely to be attached to a religious community than previous generations until older men and women. And so that is a real loss in terms of being able to establish social connections with folks.
So, I mean, are millennials moving less? Like, I mean, did you guys find that in your survey?
Yeah, I think the best evidence suggests that, comparatively, depending on how you want to define millennials, they're not moving around a lot. They are shifting jobs more than previous generations. That is true. But in terms of geographic mobility, I think it's probably a little bit less.
All right, but still the job mobility, we'll call it job mobility, could be disrupting friendship formation.
Absolutely. And again, if we are disproportionately relying on the workplace for our social life, that's going to be hugely disruptive.
Well, let's talk about this, work and friends. So a lot of friends, it sounds like a lot of friendships are made in like they're situation based. So there's church, there's club, and like a big one is work. Have you guys been able to figure out how the emphasis on using work as a way to make friends, how has that impacted American friendship with men?
Well, one of the things I think is going to be something worth watching is what happens when more Americans want to work remote, at least part of the time. What happens to workplace culture? What happens to, in DC, a big thing is happy hours, going out to grabbing a drink with your coworkers, to complain about your boss or whatever. And if that happens less often, that becomes less routinized, that's going to be a real loss. And I think it's something that probably a lot of people haven't thought through, that, when you're remote, and I've been remote for almost 18 months now, you just see people less often. I mean, I see my spouse a whole heck of a lot, but my friends I see, significantly less. And, even some of the kind of incidental contact and conversations you have with your coworkers, there's value in that. And I think, even if it's more of a friendly acquaintanceship versus a friendship, that, losing those, I think are really important for us to think about when we think about the transition that we're making here. And we have a new poll out just recently that looked at the employment situation and desire for remote work. And we're seeing actually that, I think there's this idea that a lot of people want to work remotely. They want the flexibility. And there's some truth to that. But there was a significant number of Americans, I think it's more than 4 in 10, who actually said that in-person work with their colleagues was their ideal work situation. And then the next most popular was, some flexibility, so some amount of remote work, but still largely based in office. And the minority view was a full-on remote. So I think there is some sense that people value that kind of in-person interaction that the workplace can provide.
So you mentioned church was a place where a lot of people make friends. And I think we've all read the articles that in America, religiosity has been declining for the past, steeply, I think in the past 10 years. I mean, what is the number? Do you have any grasp of the numbers, like how sharp the decrease, particularly amongst men?
Yeah, it's pretty significant. Actually, my dissertation was on this topic, looking at the decline in religiosity among millennials. And if you look at the early 1990s, that's when the shift began to happen. it was around 5 or 6% of Americans had no formal religious affiliation. Now it's up to about 1 in 4 among young adults under the age of 30. It's closer to 40%. And I think for young men, it's closer to half. So, it's stark. And, certainly some of those folks who don't identify religiously may still be, connected to a church or a congregation through their family, sort of being culturally connected. But by and large, they're not going off. And there's a strong correlation between not having a formal religious identity and not going to church or religious services.
Yeah, I've got a few friends who stopped going to church, and they say like the one thing they missed the most, they didn't realize they'd missed the most, is just I've got a built-in social network. I can go someplace and I could at least have a chance to make some friends. It's like now it's hard. I have to build that up on my own. So that's one thing they typically regret the most about not going to church.
Right. Yeah. And I have a friend at work who went to law school, and he's a member of the LDS Church. And one of the things that he talked about was how welcoming everyone was. He joined a new church, and people were immediately coming over and introducing themselves, asking them if they needed anything, and that you have kind of a built-in community no matter where you go. And I think that's a big loss. I mean, we could talk for a whole episode about religious decline and what that means socially, civically, politically. But I think it is, when we think about our declining social connections, like that's a big piece of it.
Well, and that was also disrupted by the pandemic. For a while, a lot of churches were going online, doing remote, or pared back services significantly. I mean, so did you guys do a survey like what the pandemic did to friendships? Did that cause a decline in the number of friends, or feeling that people had friends? Did that decline as well?
So we did a really interesting survey project in the middle of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. And it did affect our social lives. And there's no doubt. And we did this survey that looked at people's social networks. And so how we got at this was we asked people to name up to 7 different people in their life who they talked to about important problems in the last 6 months. So these are people who were close. These weren't people who were just, Joe or Jane coworker or an acquaintance. These are people who had a close connection to the person. And then we, some people mentioned 3 people, some people mentioned 4. And one of the things we saw is that this was also done in 2013. There's a pretty steep decline in the number of these close social connections people had. People's social networks we found were shrinking. And we asked in the survey, because we were in the midst of the pandemic, how much of this is due to the pandemic. So people who mentioned they had 0 close social connections. And only about 1/3 said it was directly due to the pandemic. So for 2/3 of people, there's sort of larger forces at play here than just being quarantined and socially isolated for over 12 months.
All right. So situational, there's one of the reasons that it's causing decline in male friendships is the situations have changed. People are relying on work for friends instead of neighborhoods or civic organizations or church. But jobs can be mobile because you're constantly changing jobs, so you don't have a chance to maintain or even establish friends. Another factor I've heard that's playing a role in the decline of friendship is that people are spending more time with their families than with their friends than people did in the past. Did your survey find anything about that?
Yeah, so this is something that I looked at and other people looked at as well, and particularly for parents. And I speak as one of a parent of young children. The amount of time parents are investing in their children has increased dramatically, and that it simply takes away time from other things you might do, from your hobbies, from your work, from your friends. And so that's a big piece of the puzzle, that we are focusing much more on our families, our spouses than we were previously. Some of this might have to do with the millennial generation being sort of socialized and because that's the cohort that is having, establishing families right now, socialized to really be emphasizing families. But I think there's some evidence that might actually be changing now. Again, in this more recent survey, we asked the question about what is essential for living a fulfilling life. What kind of things? Is it you're being married? Is it having just a romantic partner? Is it children? Is it having a good job? Is it money? And then we also asked whether it was friends. And more Americans mentioned having good friends was essential to living a fulfilling life than anything else, than being married, than having kids, having a good job. So that, like, what people think about the essential ingredients for a good life is changing. I don't know how quickly people will act on it, because one of the interesting things, there's some dissonance there. We talk a big game about the importance of friends, but we don't actually devote the time towards it. Like, if you look at the American Time Use Survey, which just looks at how people are spending their time, we devote very little time to our friends compared to other relationships. And that's actually, according to at least the Time Use Survey, that's shrinking over the last decade or so.
Well, to the topic of men spending more time with their family, particularly for that emotional support, than with their friends. I mean, I think there was part of your survey that found that young men are more likely to go talk to their parents about a personal problem than first take their problem to their friends. What was the numbers there like?
Yeah, so this was one of the more worrisome things in the poll for me, that we found that 36% of young men go to their parents first when facing a personal problem, compared to 24% of young women. And young men are much less likely to rely on their friends than they used to. And, as a parent, I think parents are kind of great. They are the people that provide us with unconditional love and support. They are ready and willing to, so hopefully support us financially and, emotionally. But it's also a unique relationship, and it's not an equal relationship either, where there's the idea of reciprocity, giving and getting in roughly equal measure. And that's what friendship really requires. And so, if young men are getting this stuff from their parents, the parents aren't going to be around forever. And again, it's a unique relationship. So I think it could be hampering their ability to establish social connections with their peers. And the big thing, and one of the reasons I think that this is so high now, is that more young people are living at home than any time since the Great Depression. And that's largely due to economic circumstances and COVID. So more than 52% of young adults are living at home. It's greater among young men. And I think this close proximity to their parents, makes them more inclined to seek out their support and advice first, as opposed to their friends.
And you think this could be an issue because it's not allowing them to grow as a man?
Yeah, to establish their own social networks, to build them out. That's sort of one of the important parts of being an adult, is establishing your own relationships, figuring out, what works, what doesn't work. And so I think that, more than anything is why that's really problematic.
The other thing too is, this might sound kind of mean, but I think parents might not have any good answers for you, because like they've had a completely different experience, right? So if you're going to them like, I can't get a job, and your dad who got a factory job right out of high school and retired and has a pension, like, what is your dad going to tell you? Well, go out there, hit the pavement, and you'll find a job. It's like, well, it's not how it works.
Or romantic relationships or anything your peers are really, really important in all this stuff, and navigating all the things that we have to learn in adulthood. Parents can provide a really helpful backdrop, but I think it's our peers, our friends, that really allow us to grow.
Yeah, dating. I don't think I have any good advice for dating for my kids. Tinder, I don't know. What's your profile picture? I have no clue. What do you do when you get ghosted? I have no idea. That sounds terrible.
And there's some things you probably just don't want to share with your parents, right? That's totally understandable. And so I think, to the extent that men can again establish their own relationship with their friends, I think that, will be important for the rest of their lives. And we know this, we know that friendship matters for the entire duration of your life. It's not just important for when you're young or before you get married. There is in fact some research that says among seniors, friendship becomes even more important than family relationships.
So besides going to their parents for emotional support, if they're married, men will tend to go to their spouses first before they go to a friend about a problem. How has that changed from previous decades?
Yeah, so we know that in our survey, Americans are talking to their spouse first when they have a problem, and that's more than anyone else. Not surprising, right? It's a unique relationship. But we found the number of people relying on their spouse increased about 10 points over the last 30 or so years. So men rely on their spouse more than women do, and there's like a 20-point gap there. So many women will go to a friend first or a family member, whereas men were all, nearly exclusively reliant on their spouse.
And is that because like men feel they can't go to a friend about this stuff and they just got to go to their wife?
Yeah, and I think the intimacy that women have with a number of different people, a lot of men only have with their spouse. And I think this is the problem, returning to our, we were talking about earlier, it puts a lot of pressure on wives to be the absolute everything in terms of emotional and personal support. If I can't have these, difficult conversations, if I can't get the emotional support from a friend, well, I've got to get it from somewhere, or I don't get it at all, which is this entirely different problem. But it puts a lot more strain on a marriage when you can't, when your wife has to be everything for you. So I think that's something to really consider. Men do their wives the favor by, reaching out and having good friendships. So they have a broader group of folks to rely on when things get tough.
No, yeah, that's one of the advice that I give dudes who get married. When you first get married, I feel like there's a tendency, I just want to spend time with my wife. She's awesome. She's great. There's that honeymoon. But at a certain point, you have to start making male friends. It's going to be better for your relationship if you do.
Absolutely.
So another thing I've heard and read from friendship experts is that one of the reasons that men tend to have fewer friends than women is that men tend to rely on their wives for their social networks. So I can see why that would result in a less robust social network, because you just have this one person who's providing your social calendar. But it did provide some connections, so there was a benefit there. One thing I thought of as I was reading through your survey that could also be contributing to the decline in male friendship today is that men today are getting married later, or they're not getting married at all. So you have like this double whammy going on. You have men who aren't prioritizing friendships themselves, trying to make friendships on their own, and they don't have a wife for those social connections either.
Yeah, no, I think that is something that we found in our data, that single men particularly had significantly fewer friends than married men, and to single women. So marriage, I think, is often set up as kind of an antagonist or set up in opposition to friendship. But really, marriage can benefit, for the reasons we talked about. You suddenly gain a lot of social connections through your spouse. A lot of us will meet additional friends through our spouse or our spouse's work. So there's a lot of social benefit that is gained from getting married. And we actually see this, interestingly, that men are more likely to value marriage right now and to say that it's essential than women are, which is really interesting. And I think it's because men receive so much from marriage, right? They get, someone they're emotionally connected with, someone who's committed to their welfare and well-being. And then women are like, yeah, I get this from my marriage, but I also get this from my friends. And that is something that men are lacking, or at least a lot of men are lacking.
Yeah, and also when you get married, typically you have kids. It's often something you do. And like having kids is another way to expand your social networks. You're going to get involved in scouts, the school. You might coach peewee baseball or whatever. And so you might not become best friends with the parents, but like you at least put yourself in a situation where friendships could be made.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in a phase right now that we do play dates like every weekend. So we're hanging out and talking with our parents, and doing the brunch thing where the kids are playing in the other room, and it's great. And what happens, I think, when we get older and our lives get really busy is we kind of put friendships on, we kind of add them on to things we're already doing and fit into our lives. And then those are the kind of friendships that we create and maintain. And there's value there, right? They may not become really intimate friends or a close friend or even a best friend, but there's still a lot of value in those relationships.
Have you, like in your survey, did you figure out like what people are doing if like they don't have friends, they're not married, they don't have kids? Like what are people just like, they just go to their house and just sit by themselves? Like what do people do?
They're haven't you heard they're fixing up old vans and driving them across the country.
Okay. Looking for friends.
Yeah, well, I think that there's research that has shown that the amount of time we've spent in the office and on our work has increased pretty significantly. So we're definitely pouring more time into work. We just, again, had this new survey come out, and people are engaged not only in full-time jobs, but pursuing side hustles as well. And so I think we've been kind of oriented to think that that's what you need, right? To be successful, you need to have a good job and career. You need to get married. You need to start a family. And now we're starting to think like, well, there's a lot else out there, and friends are becoming a more important part of the equation. And ironically, right, at the very moment we need more friends, our social circles are shrinking. Right, as you mentioned, we're the average age of marriage now, I think for men is like 30, and for women it's 28, and so we're single longer. And for single people, friends are really the most important relationship for the most part that we have, and we have just fewer of them. And so it's really challenging. And I think it's why you're seeing, one of the reasons anyway, you're seeing this increased levels of loneliness and social isolation and depression and anxiety among young people. This, like, we haven't emphasized, I think, societally, and given the tools for people to build and establish lifelong friendships.
Okay, so this idea that people, they're saying they want friends or friends are going to be important, this goes to a question I've been trying to mull over. I've been mulling over for the past few years, because every time I have like these loneliness experts come on the podcast, they always define loneliness. It's a subjective feeling, right? So the idea you can be surrounded with 6 friends and still feel lonely and isolated, or you could just have one friend and you feel like, wow, this is great. I hit the jackpot. I got this one friend. And your survey kind of hinted at that this is something like this is going on. So I think one of the thing you found is that Americans with one close friend feel just as lonely or isolated as those without any close friends. Those with 2 friends only feel a little less lonely than those with no friends. And people with 3 or fewer friends still regularly feel lonely and isolated. When I read that, like, man, you got 3 friends? Like, that should be plenty and something you'd be happy with, but a lot of people don't seem to be. And your survey found that only about half of Americans feel satisfied with the number of friends. And for men, less than half are satisfied. And so this gets to the question, okay, some people have friends, but even with the friends they have, they're not happy with it. Do we maybe have like too high expectations of what friendship should look like the number of friends we have and what our friendship should be like with that person? And because those expectations aren't met, we feel lonely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And this was among the most surprising findings in the poll, this idea that you need a lot of friends, right? Like, in terms of forestalling loneliness and social isolation, depression, anxiety, that it's not just having a best friend or even 1 or 2 close friends that matters. You need to have a few. And the survey didn't get this directly, but I have some theories for why that is. And one of which is it may take, given the busyness of our lives, it may take having access to more than one friend to really get the benefit. You may have a friend who's busy. You may have a friend who's married with kids, may not be able to, may not be available when you need them. And so I think like having a broader social network is really important. The other thing that I think, and this is not something that I've seen a lot, and maybe you have some perspective on this too, is that friendship groups are something that I'm increasingly interested in. And it may be that friendship groups offer some considerable personal benefit. One person can initiate a get together. Group pressure may convince people to come who otherwise may have found an excuse not to. And to order to have a friendship group, you need more than 2. You need probably more than 3. And so I think that there's some benefit there. And we know from our survey that a significant number of Americans have friendship groups where people know each other. And that is a significant benefit to folks. And so I think like that's something to think about as well in terms of the, our expectations and whether they're realistic. I think social media in so many ways is not our friend, if you'll excuse the expression. That, we see these people out having fun, doing really great things. People are all together. Instagram is horrible in this way. And there's this idea like, wow, my friends don't do this, or I don't, seem to have the same kind of connection. I don't seem to be laughing as much when I'm hanging out with my friends. And so I think like it can give us kind of a tilted view when it comes to what we should expect from friendship.
Yeah, I think that's going on. I think our expectations are too high for friendship, and we're always going to be disappointed. From your survey, were you able to get any insights from people who have fulfilling friendships? Like, what are they doing differently than those who don't have fulfilling friendships?
Well, one of the things that we did a little analysis of people who have best friends. And one of the questions that we asked Well, so what makes this person your best friend? So we actually allowed respondents to say in their own words what it was that made this friend special and unique. And it was really interesting how many people mentioned how long they had known this person. So longevity was really a key part of it. And I think it just takes time to build up intimacy and connection. And so people talk about the shared language among friends, and that you don't need to talk often, but you need to have a similarity drawing from the same experiences. So I think that's kind of a crucial component. Yes, you can develop tight relationships maybe over a year or two, but those people who are your best friends, those really close relationships, have been around a while.
Okay, so obviously the intent of this survey is to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. You're just trying to give people a general lay of the land of friendship in America today. But are there any policy changes or institutional changes or just general takeaways you hope people walk away with after they read your survey results?
Yeah, so professionally, I'm agnostic on policy. I work in Washington, D.C., where everything's political. So I really try to stay out of recommending or wanting policy changes. But obviously, when it comes to something, so basic as friendship, I would love to see groups, pick it up, run with it. We've identified a pretty significant issue, I think, and we're going to produce more research on this topic in the future. So definitely stay tuned. But for me, I've been a researcher my entire life. I've been doing polling from my 20s onward, and so I don't really get involved in the policy debates, nor do I've actually any good ideas about the correct interventions. Other than again, culturally, societally, we should just emphasize friendship. We should sort of say, hey, you know what? Marriage is great. There's a lot of great things about marriage. But, if you're looking to build a complete life, you've really got to spend some time and think about friendships. And, employers should too. And church leaders should as well, right? They should think about friendship in a way that, in the way that people practice it, in the way that people think about it. So meet them where they are and not try to prescribe something to them.
Well, I think the takeaway too, and just listening to you talking about the different changes in friendship is, okay, people seem to be putting emphasis on friendship, but I think the big takeaway is if you want friends, it's kind of on you now. There's no longer those institutions that are basically support friendship. Yeah, you have work, but work is constantly shifting. Your fellow coworker could leave jobs, or you could leave jobs. A lot of people are going to church. If you're not going to do that, you have to be really intentional about it and make it happen for yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that is at the heart of this thing. Yeah, friendships are really unique in that way. There's not the same kind of structure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, they are completely voluntary and they come in a wide variety. And something else I would mention too is that a friendship doesn't have to provide you with everything, right? It doesn't have to be the most intimate, the most connected. Friendship to be worthwhile and to be of value. And so, I'm talking about, from my own experience, these friends with the parents we've made through our kids' daycare. And, for a lot of these folks, yeah, we probably won't become close friends, but there's the friendship and the community we get are just invaluable to us.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a lot of times people, when they look for a friend, they're looking for a friend that will hit all their sweet spots on their interests and have a lot in common. But it's okay to have friends who are, okay, this is my work friend and this is my peewee baseball parent friend, this is my gym friend. You don't have to have everything in common to be a friend.
Absolutely.
Well, Daniel, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the survey and your work?
So I would absolutely encourage you to, we're very active on Twitter. I'm at DCox, COX polls. So you can find our work there. And then on our website as well, we are at americansurveycenter.org.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel Cox, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
My guest today was Daniel Cox. He's the director of the Survey Center on American Life. You can find out the survey that we discussed today at americansurveycenter.org. It's under the title American Men Suffer a Friendship Recession. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/friendship recession, where you can find links to resources where we delve deeper into this topic.